after COVID, how many more people got lonely and how this is bad for our health. So I do think there is a little bit more awareness, although again, people look for easy solutions and there is no pill that will make you suddenly not lonely or suddenly, better connected or happily married. So this is why I think people often look still more for some kind of superfoods or supplements or the new running watch that will suddenly make you healthier because it's just easier in a way. I mean, it's certainly the one that, that exercise and diet are absolutely everything. And I don't want to say that exercise and diet are not important because they are very important, but they are not everything. So if you add all the good things you can do with your life, eating absolutely perfectly, eating all the vegetables, avoiding sugar and processed foods, and exercising as much as you're supposed to, both cardio and, the muscles and absolutely everything, each of them reduce mortality about 22%. And so altogether, if you put everything together up, you can lower your risk of mortality or risk of dying soon, let's say, about 66%. Whereas if you don't do the social parts, then this is it, right? But, if you really want to extend your life, being social, being with other people, it gives you about the same amount as you get from exercise and diet. So if you imagine you have two people, we have person A, who is a exercise obsessed person who eats absolutely perfectly, but doesn't have any friends or family, is not involved in the community, just lives on their own. And then you have a second person who, doesn't eat the best, is slightly overweight, doesn't exercise much, but is really surrounded by people and has meaning in life and engage in volunteering and helps the community. Actually, it's basically impossible to say who has a better health habits because both, according at least to research, would be reducing their risk of basically early death by the same amount. So obviously the best thing to do here is to do both. So be, both very socially connected and eat healthy and exercise and so on. Of course, I realize, that takes a lot of time to do everything, but certainly there are ways to do both. So, you can, for example, run with a friend instead of running alone. Or if you eat something healthy, you better eat it with someone else than alone again. So there are ways to combine, but it's not that if you do just a healthy eating and diet, you are completely fine and covered because you're missing a huge chunk of what makes people live long. And especially social isolation and loneliness are very, very big in terms of how much they impact our longevity and health. Studies show that social isolation, so when you are basically you don't have enough people around you, it shortens telomeres. So these are these protective caps at the ends of telomeres that basically protect them and make us live longer. It can reduce, and for example, volunteering, it can reduce mortality by about 22 to even 44%. And this is about the same as eating 6 or more portions of fruits and vegetables per day. And this is just the volunteering, right? So you can really see that there is no one answer. Like being social has such a huge impact on our longevity that even if somebody is maybe not perfect on their diet and exercise, they can really get a lot of health benefit from just being a very social person. I mean, absolutely. I do think it's very valid and perhaps even more valid. And I think the pandemic was a big thing here because it really brought us attention to how being social is important and how we actually do need other people in our life. Being locked down alone for many people was a big eye opener. But unfortunately, I think we're starting to forget this lesson already. It's been a long time now and people are kind of moving on. But what happened was there a lot of research came out of it after pandemic on exactly social isolation and how disastrous it was for people's mental health and then also actual physical health as well. So not only people were much more depressed and sad and stressed and dealing much worse with anxiety when they were alone during the pandemic, but actually their bodies were functioning worse as well. So there is fascinating research showing that when people are socially isolated, they actually respond worse to viruses, which is very ironic because, this is how what we're doing to prevent spread of COVID was of course necessary. But on the other hand, our immune systems work better when we are surrounded by other people. There were actually some experiments in which people were infected with cold viruses on purpose. That was pre-COVID. So some volunteers agreed to have cold virus directly inserted into their nose. And the researchers checked who was more socially connected and who was less socially connected. And those people who were more socially connected actually were much less likely to fall sick after the same dose of the virus than people who are not socially connected. And in terms of COVID, for example, there was also quite a lot of research showing that the vaccine response was different in people who were very social. So those who had few friends who were not social, who were alone and isolated, actually responded worse to the vaccine. So they would not produce the same amount of antibodies than people who were very socially connected. So, how well the vaccine worked depended on how many friends you had, which was really, really fascinating for me. I think it was pretty good. So I had quite a lot of letters from readers, and I also have been invited to do workshops for companies, especially, including Google, on how sociality impacts health, and also in terms of worker health, because now we have this remote work trends, and many people are starting to wonder how is it impacting their employees, both in their mental health and their physical health. And the answer is not the best. So there are obviously benefits of remote work, but if there is too much of it, and if some people work basically constantly only remotely, that can have consequences. And for example, there is new research coming out showing that when we are in presence of other people, actual physical presence, our brain waves synchronize. So our brains are literally on the same wave. You can measure it. They use this kind of funny electrograms when they kind of put a lot of electrodes on people's heads and they can see the brain waves synchronize. But this happens because we look each other directly into the eyes. So when we have direct eye contact, that happens. And also when we kind of mimic subconsciously the body language of other people. And when that happens, when we do synchronize our brains, we like the other people more, we feel more connected to them. And we also are better at teamwork, which is of course very important for companies and for people working, because yes, you are a better team if you are in physical presence of each other. But actually, this kind of synchrony doesn't happen over Zoom. There were direct studies testing this, and our brains just don't synchronize the same way over Zoom. And the reason for this is, I can see you now, but you're all flat, and I can really not make eye contact with you, because if I look at your eyes, I don't look at the camera and so on. So we cannot have a real eye contact, and this actually causes that the brain synchrony is just not there, and so it's not the same. And actually, this is also apparently one of the reasons why people experience Zoom fatigue. When you have a lot of Zoom meetings, you are really exhausted afterwards. And actually, people feel more exhausted after Zoom meetings than they feel after normal meetings. And this kind of lack of brain synchrony and this kind of general way that our bodies cannot synchronize, it throws our brains off. We evolved to be able to do that. And this is why we feel tired afterwards. Um, Perhaps not. I think my first book was a little bit more controversial. It was on meat. And but I mean, there are some things that I would like to change myself. So I wrote about pesticides, for instance, in my book, and organic food was a very small side note, but I wrote that organic is not that important. And new research now comes and shows that, it is actually maybe much more important than I thought. And I'm eating organic myself now with all the kind of pollution and, and heavy metals in the soils and everything. So there are some things I would like to update, but in general, I think the response was pretty good. I think it was the experiment I did on kindness that was really eye-opening for me. So it was really a fun experiment that I've done. I mean, experiment, I was a sample of one, so it's not very scientific, but we kind of tried to replicate on me, so I could experience it myself, the kind of experiments that scientists did before. And I worked with two scientists at University College London. And what we did is that they sent me a lot of little salivettes. There are like little cotton fangs in tubes that I had to chew 3 times a day, like a chewing gum. And it collected my saliva for testing for cortisol. This is the stress hormone, so called. So I did it in the morning, in around lunchtime, and in the evening. For a week. And during that week, I also had to write like a diary that's what happened in my life, what I did, and how stressed I was, and things like that. And also, we chose 2 days out of that week. I think it was two, maybe. Yeah, I think it was two. That I would be very kind to other people, like extra kind. So I would do all those kind of random acts of kindness, like feeding stray cats, or letting people pass in traffic, or I bought a sandwich for a homeless person. I left some smiley note on my neighbor's car. Silly small things, like small things like that. And not only it was really fun to plan, like even sitting in the morning and thinking, okay, what nice things I'm gonna do today, was really nice. But then when we actually analyzed, because then all those samples went to the lab, and the scientists analyzed my levels of the stress hormones on all those days. And they could see a very clear difference than on the days when I was kind to other people, extra kind. My cortisol levels were behaving in a much healthier way. Not only in general, I had less of the stress hormone, but also there is something like when you wake up, you have a lot of cortisol, and then it's supposed to kind of fall a lot. So my slope, like my kind of line, was much healthier and better, meaning that I was experiencing much less stress, even though on one of those days, a lot of things were happening in my life that I thought were stressful, but in fact, my body was still behaving as if I were much less stressed because of this, all the kindness I was doing. And this replicated just on me, for me, what I've read in other studies, because there were big studies on big numbers of people that also showed exactly how kindness changes the body, and it calms down our stress response. So we don't feel so stressed, and we know that stress is a big contributor to all the chronic diseases of modernity. There are even studies showing that when people do this kind of kindness experiments, there was one that's over 6 weeks, a big group of people, some were doing kindness, some were not doing kindness, some were doing something kind to themselves. And it showed that their gene expression changed. So it means which of their genes were turned on or off. And they were turned on in a way that made them kind of more healthy. So that was really impressive to see that just being kind to others can, in such small ways, can have such a big impact. I mean, so there was some, apart from the pandemic stuff, there was also a very interesting research on how loneliness actually changes our brain in a physical way. So basically, if we're lonely, our brains get rewired that make us kind of behave in a way that makes us even more lonely. So it's a kind of a catch-22 that our brains basically make us stuck in loneliness. If it continues for a while, if you feel lonely for a day or two or a week, that's not a big deal. But if you're chronically lonely, it actually changes how your brain is wired. And what happens then is that you start seeing other people as less friendly, and you think that they are more unreliable, you think they are more judgmental of you, which is not necessarily the case. This is just your brain changed on loneliness, which is kind of very sad, because then it's really hard to get out of loneliness, because it makes you see the world as more hostile. So for people who have been chronically lonely, realizing that maybe this is not necessarily reality, that people are very unfriendly to you. Maybe it's just your loneliness talking. Then perhaps it might help some people to get out of loneliness, to realize it. But there is this kind of exactly fascinating experiments showing that, even some experiments show that even after one day of loneliness, there's already a little bit of change of how we see the world. So the more we are alone, the more differently we perceive others, and generally in a negative way. I mean, so in terms of research and exciting, there is a lot of things happening, and there is more and more research exactly showing how important our social lives are for our health. There is more research on exactly neurology and how our brains behave on loneliness and how we need touch, for instance, that when another person touches you, your brain activates differently. So, for example, that we can experience less pain, or, for example, smell is important. So there is a lot of new research showing that we can literally smell the emotions of other people. So when you are near others, you subconsciously pick up molecules that their bodies emit that in different emotional states, and that infects you with their emotions. So for instance, if you smell somebody who is stressed, you will subconsciously pick up on it and you will slightly feel more stressed as well. Or if they're happy, you will pick up on their happiness. And actually, there are studies where scientists attached electrodes to people's faces to pick up the tiniest little changes in the muscle movements. So you can see when they can smell, even not knowing it, the smell of happiness, their muscles will move slightly, like if they were smiling more. So we really pick up on those kind of signals from other people, which again, we cannot do if we are over Zoom or we are just texting on our phones. We really need this kind of physical presence with other people to connect with them and to understand each other. Because, if you can smell their emotions, that's really, you connect on a deeper level. No matter what they tell you, you can still smell what they really feel, which for me is really, really fascinating. I mean, a little bit, although more still most focus is on the food and diet and exercise. Again, the money thing. So if there is money, there'll be more focus on it. But there has been definitely more research and talk, especially because of one big person who changed a lot, I think, is Vivek Murthy, who was the former Surgeon General of the United States. And he was a really big proponent of fighting loneliness as a measure of health. So I think he did a lot good there to raise awareness of how important this topic is, especially loneliness, and especially, after COVID, how many more people got lonely and how this is bad for our health. So I do think there is a little bit more awareness, although again, people look for easy solutions, and there is no pill that will make you suddenly not lonely or suddenly, better connected or happily married. So this is why I think people often look still more for some kind of superfoods or supplements or the new running watch that will suddenly make you healthier, because it's just easier in a way. So easier short term, but perhaps not long term, but it's easier short term. I mean, so exactly the fact that it's not that easy, and we are all stuck on our phones. I think this is a huge one. So people just choose the easiest path. And unfortunately, as I said before, even loneliness rewires your brain, but we also know that being on the phones changes how we see the world. And yeah, it gets harder and harder to connect with other people in this, modern world. And this is definitely not good and it's definitely not easy. So this is a huge barrier. And I do worry how things will go in the future. And I do hope that people do realize that we are an extremely social species. So Homo sapiens is considered as actually the most social animal in the world because we evolved like that. Our superpower was being social. We are not very fast, we are not very dangerous, we are not very strong, but we are very, very social. And this way we created our civilization, cooperating with others, being with others, doing stuff with others. And this is why our bodies, they still function the best when we are surrounded by other people, because this is how we evolved. If you look at chimpanzees, which are our closest cousins, they are always in a big pack. There, you don't see that, a lonely chimpanzee here, a lonely chimpanzee here in their little apartments on their phones. It's like they're all always in a pack, and this is how we function the best as well. So if you separate people, it's just unnatural. In a zoo, when we have animals, we always try to make the environment the way they evolved to, so they feel happy and function the best, so they are healthy and so on. But for ourselves, we do something exactly opposite. We close ourselves in little cages, even though this is not how a human being as a species has evolved or functions well. So this is definitely a big problem. I mean, so to be honest, I do not have any plans for future books, and um, it's not that I wouldn't. I will perhaps I would like to write one, but the reality is also that the readership of nonfiction in the United States is really falling, which is another problem. So people prefer to read articles or listen to podcasts. So I've been writing more articles these days than concentrating on another book. And I'm also writing more articles, like longer articles, with more storytelling. So this is what I'm doing right now. I mean, so it's kind of ironic because if you live meaningfully, you're probably also gonna live longer and healthier. So it's kind of, uh, but yeah, absolutely. I think this is extremely important topic that's, we have to make the best of your life. And I've been recently listening to a podcast with American scientist of Japanese origin, Shiga Oishi, and he writes about three pillars of happiness. So one is this kind of simple happiness, just being satisfied with your life. The second one is finding meaning, so some kind of purpose in life that you feel that your life has some kind of goal and you're doing something in this world, changing it for a better. And the third one is actually having psychologically rich life. So kind of things that are varied, that challenge you, that you don't do the same thing over and over, but that you kind of push yourself to experience different things, new things, have new emotions, not necessarily always happy emotions, because you can have an experience that's stressful or even maybe disturbing, but it's different and it changes you in a way. And this is what he calls the psychological richness that also makes life better, and it's important for our development, right? So it's not just chasing pleasure and happiness, but just chasing different ways to live and see the world and have different perspective. And for us, for meaning, we know that it's extremely important for our life, most likely more important than this kind of hedonic happiness, that kind of just having a nice cake or latte somewhere is not as important for your both mental well-being and your physical health. There were actually studies that directly compared the two, and showed that people who had more this kind of meaning in life versus just hedonic happiness had actually more favorable gene expression related to stress. So they had more of the good genes turned on and more of the bad genes turned off. So it really shows that just chasing pleasure is not necessarily the way to go, that you have to look for something more, and which may look on surface as not so Instagram perfect, but it actually makes for a happier and longer life. I mean, yes, that was the Woody Allen quote in one of his movies. He said, "I don't get angry, I grow a tumor instead." I mean, definitely suppressing emotions is never a good idea. But I think that there are also big cultural differences here between, Eastern Asian culture and European culture, because we are much more individualistic than you guys are. And in general, being more tuned to others is a good thing. So it's really hard for me to comment how much, there is the pressure for niceness in Korean culture versus European culture. In Europe, I would say that we are not pushing enough for people to be nice, because there is a huge focus on everybody should be just, everything is about me. I should take care of me. My feelings are what matters. My well-being is what matters, and it's very self-focused. And I think this is not a way to go. So, but I really don't know how it is in Korea. It's maybe that you are too much on the other spectrum. I don't know. So it's really hard for me to answer. I mean, I am still working on it. But I think my two main ways of getting purpose is, I mean, the one of them is that I have a daughter and trying to be the best mother I can and trying to raise her as a happy, well-adjusted person is definitely one way I find purpose. Um, and the other way is through my work. So trying to bring science closer to people, make it understandable, and hopefully improve their lives this way, and also give people voice. I write more these days about environmental justice and pollution. So letting people tell their story, it gives me a lot of purpose. But even small things, just exactly this kind of random kindness. If I can each day make a tiny little thing that makes world a little bit better, tiny, teeny bit better, like pick up some garbage on the way to work kind of thing, then I feel that this is nice. But I do forget about those things. Sometimes I catch myself in this kind of daily rush, and I do forget about, the fact that I should have some purpose in my life. But coming back from time to time, it's a good way to remind yourself that those things are important. And as for trying to find it, I think reading books, some kind of about philosophy, that always helps. Viktor Frankl is obviously the classic on the meaning in life, but there are many other great books that can help people just think, take a pause and think about their lives and how they could experience purpose. Um, yeah, that's my advice.